In March 1994, during the demolition of an old Victorian residence in Buckinghamshire, England, three operators discovered something that would make them abandon the job immediately and question everything they claimed to know about that seemingly ordinary house. Under the floorboards of the master bedroom, hidden in an artificial cavity that had been carefully constructed between the wooden beams, was a rusty metal box sealed with multiple layers of industrial tape, as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that it would never be opened again. Inside, protected by bubble wrap yellowed with age, was a cassette tape with a handwritten label in faded blue ink that simply read, "Do not open, private property, 1964. The handwriting was shaky, hurried, as if it had been written by someone in a state of deep nervousness or fear. Driven by the natural curiosity of those who spend days demolishing walls and discovering the forgotten secrets of old houses, the workers took the tape to the foreman, a man in his 50s named Robert Holloway, who decided to listen to it on an old tape recorder he kept in his trailer to play music during lunch. For the first 10 seconds, all that could be heard was static, harsh and continuous, that characteristic sound of old tapes that have been stored away for decades without being played. Then, gradually emerging from the background noise, a heavy, irregular breathing became audible, as if someone were trying to laugh before speaking. And then, breaking the tense silence, a middle-aged male voice began to speak in a low and deliberately controlled tone, as if confessing something directly to the listener, choosing each word with painful care. According to detailed accounts from the 4 workers who were present in that cramped trailer on that cold March afternoon, the content of the recording was so deeply disturbing and psychologically distressing that Robert abruptly turned off the device after only 3 minutes and 15 seconds of playback, his hands visibly trembling as he pressed the stop button. The men looked at each other in heavy silence for several seconds, no one knowing exactly what to say or how to process what they had just heard. They all agreed, without much discussion, that this was not something that could simply be ignored or dismissed as a strange piece of amateur theater or experimental art from the 60s. It had to be handed over to the authorities immediately, before curiosity led them to listen to the rest of the recording. The next morning, at 9 o'clock sharp, a tape was in the hands of the Thames Valley Police, where it was received by 2 detectives from the Historical Crimes Division who immediately recognized the potential gravity of what they had in their hands. An investigation was opened and quickly categorized as sensitive and urgent, with access restricted only to senior officers and researchers specializing in cold cases. The Buckinghamshire house was sealed off, and a forensic team spent 5 full days sifting through every inch of the property, removing boards, working walls, and digging up the garden in search of any additional evidence that might be hidden. What they found during this search was never officially disclosed, but rumors among investigators suggested that the cassette tape wasn't the only disturbing thing on the property. For exactly 30 years, from 1994 to 2024, no official information was publicly released about the specific content of the recording or about what exactly the police discovered during the intensive months of investigation that followed. Documents related to the case were immediately sealed under court orders, classified as sensitive evidence under active investigation indefinitely. Witnesses, including the workers who found the tape and the first police officers who listened to it, were formally instructed not to comment on the case publicly under threat of prosecution for obstruction of justice. The very existence of the tape was virtually erased from accessible public records, as if someone in a position of power had decided that the fewer people who knew about that recording, the better it would be for everyone. Until, in October 2024, an anonymous leak sent to 3 different investigative journalists brought disturbing fragments of this buried story to light. What you are about to learn in the next parts of this video is a meticulous reconstruction based on leaked testimonies from retired investigators who worked on the case, partially redacted documents obtained through anonymous sources within the police department, and detailed analyses by forensic experts and criminal psychologists who had indirect access to the material through professional connections. This is the complete story of the Buckinghamshire tape, the man who made it, what he confessed on that tape, and the deep and disturbing mystery that British police apparently don't want the public to know, even 30 decades after its initial discovery. The voice on the recording belonged to a man who identified himself only as Thomas and claimed to be 42 years old at the time he made that cassette tape confession, which would place his birth around 1922, making him part of the generation that lived through World War II in their youth. According to linguistic analysis later carried out by experts from the University of Cambridge who were discreetly consulted by the police, the accent of the man indicated origin in the central region of England, probably the Midlands, with educational characteristics that suggested complete secondary education, but not necessarily university. The tone of his voice was peculiarly controlled, almost monotone at times, but occasionally broken by long pauses and deep breaths that suggested considerable effort to maintain emotional composure. There was something rehearsed in the way he spoke, as if he had practiced that confession multiple times before finally recording, choosing and refining each phrase to convey exactly what he wanted without revealing too much. In the opening minutes of the recording, which totals approximately 53 minutes according to the leaked documents, Thomas establishes the purpose of his confession in a direct and disturbing manner. He clearly states that he is recording this because he knows he is dying, that the doctors have given him a maximum of 6 months to live due to terminal cancer that has already spread to multiple organs, and that he cannot leave this world carrying the weight of what he has done without at least leaving a record of the truth. He specifically mentions that he will not go directly to the police because he doesn't have the courage to face the legal consequences in the months he has left to live, preferring to spend his last days in relative peace, but that hiding the tape in the house where it all began is his way of ensuring that one day, perhaps decades in the future, someone will discover what he has to say. There is a calculated coldness in this decision, a kind of cowardly moral game where he seeks relief for his conscience without truly accepting punishment or responsibility while he's still alive to face it. Thomas then begins to describe events that occurred during the summer of 1963, exactly 1 year before the date he wrote on the tape label, in a narrative that alternates between banal details of daily life and deeply disturbing confessions. He talks about how he met a young woman named Elizabeth at a local fair in June of that year, describing her as a 19-year-old girl with long brown hair, expressive blue eyes, and a smile that, in his words, lit up any room she entered. The level of detail with which Thomas describes Elizabeth is both poetic and deeply unsettling, revealing an obsession that goes far beyond normal romantic interest. He mentions the exact color of the dress she wore the day they met, the perfume she preferred, the specific way she laughed when she was nervous, and dozens of other small details that suggest he spent months, possibly years, observing every aspect of her life with obsessive and morbid attention. As the narrative progresses in the recording, Thomas reveals that he developed what he calls a special connection with Elizabeth, although it quickly becomes apparent through his own words that this feeling was completely one-sided and based on a distorted reality that existed only in his mind. He describes how he began to casually show up at places he knew she frequented, how he memorized her entire daily routine, how he found out where she lived and worked, and how he gradually inserted himself into her social life through mutual acquaintances. Elizabeth, as he admits with a shocking lack of self-awareness, was polite and friendly to him, but never showed any real romantic interest, always maintaining a respectful distance and treating him more like a distant acquaintance than a close friend. For anyone listening to this part of the recording, it becomes painfully clear that Thomas was stalking and harassing this young woman, but in his distorted narrative, he presents his actions as if they were part of an unrequited but fundamentally legitimate romance. The turning point in the story, the moment where the recording goes from disturbing to genuinely terrifying, occurs when Thomas describes what he calls the night everything changed, which was apparently a party in August 1963 when Elizabeth finally confronted him directly about his behavior. According to his account, she took him to a more secluded corner and, firmly but trying to remain polite, told him clearly that his interest was not reciprocated, that she was feeling uncomfortable with how often he appeared in her life, and that it would be better if he stopped pursuing her and moved on.
The way Thomas describes this moment of rejection reveals much about his psychological state. He expresses no understanding or remorse for having made Elizabeth feel uncomfortable, but rather anger and a sense of betrayal, as if she had violated some tacit agreement between them that existed only in his imagination. He talks about how he felt a rage growing inside him, about how she had no right to discard him like that after everything, about how he needed to make her understand in some definitive way. It's at this specific point in the recording that investigators who worked on the case report feeling a genuine chill run down their spines, because it becomes absolutely clear that Thomas is about to confess something horrific. His voice suddenly changes tone, becoming even lower and more tense, and he pauses for almost 15 full seconds before continuing, a pause laden with weight and meaning that even decades later, listening to a worn-out recording, still conveys the enormity of what is to come. When he finally begins to speak again, Thomas simply says, "So I did what needed to be done. I followed her when she left the party, alone, around 11 p.m. at night, and I made sure she would never reject anyone again." The casual coldness with which he pronounces these words, as if
After making that devastating initial confession, Thomas spends the next 7 minutes of the recording describing in meticulous and deeply disturbing detail exactly what he did that August night in 1963. Details so specific and visceral that investigators who first listened to the tape reported feeling physically nauseous during playback. He describes how he followed Elizabeth for 3 blocks through dimly lit streets of the small town, keeping enough distance not to be noticed, but close enough not to lose sight of her. How his heart raced, not from fear or nervousness, but from something he describes as excitement and purpose. He recounts how he seized a moment when she passed through a dark, narrow alley between 2 closed shops, a shortcut she apparently used regularly to shorten her way home, and how it was in that alley that he finally acted, quickly approaching from behind while she was distracted searching for her keys in her purse. The details he provides about the following minutes are so specific and correspond so precisely to the type of information that only someone who actually committed such a crime could know, that there was no doubt in the minds of the investigators that they were dealing with a genuine confession and not some morbid fantasy or fabricated story. What makes this section of the recording particularly distressing for investigators is not only the brutality of the acts that Thomas describes, but the complete absence of remorse or humanity in his voice as he recounts these events. He speaks of Elizabeth not as a real person with a life, dreams, family, and future, but as an object that disappointed him and needed to be fixed in some way. At no point during this part of the confession does he use her name again, referring to her only as she or the girl, a linguistic dehumanization that criminal psychologists would later identify as typical of predators who need to depersonalize their victims to justify their actions to themselves. He describes her muffled screams with the same emotional indifference with which one would describe the sound of a car passing on the street. He mentions how the body stopped struggling after a few minutes, with the same tone he would use to say that the rain stopped falling. This complete dissociation between the moral enormity of his actions and the coldness with which he recounts them suggests a level of psychopathy or profound personality disorder that goes far beyond a crime of passion or a moment of temporary madness. Even more disturbing than the description of the crime itself is what Thomas reveals next about what he did immediately afterward. He explains with precise logistical detail how he transported Elizabeth's body in his own car, a blue 1959 Ford Anglia that he had strategically parked just 2 blocks away, wrapped in an old rug that he kept in the trunk specifically for that purpose, a revelation that suggests premeditation and not an impulsive act of anger. He describes driving for nearly 40 minutes to a secluded rural area he knew well from his solitary weekend walks, a small, dense wood near a stream where he knew there was rarely any human activity. There, using tools he had brought with him, including a shovel he had bought 3 weeks earlier in a hardware store in another town, he spent 5 hours digging a makeshift grave under the intermittent light of a flashlight, working methodically even as his muscles ached and his hands bled, forming blisters that eventually burst. The way he describes this grueling physical labor, focusing on practical details such as soil consistency and the necessary depth to prevent animals from disturbing the site, reveals a mind working with cold, calculated efficiency even in the most extreme circumstances. Thomas then makes a revelation that completely transformed the nature of the police investigation when the tape was finally discovered in 1994. He clearly states with precise geographical accuracy exactly where he buried Elizabeth's body that August night in 1963, providing specific landmarks including a peculiar horseshoe-shaped rock formation, an ancient oak tree with its trunk split in half by lightning years earlier, and the approximate distance to the nearest country road. He explains that he is providing this information not out of genuine remorse or a desire for Elizabeth to receive a proper burial, but because he wants, when this tape is eventually found, probably long after my death, someone to know that I did this, that I was the one who solved the mystery of her disappearance. There is a disturbing arrogance in this motivation, a desire for posthumous recognition for his work, as if he were leaving some kind of macabre legacy that he wanted to ensure was correctly attributed to him. This need for credit for his crimes, even if only discovered decades later, revealed to forensic psychologists a deep narcissism operating in conjunction with his psychopathy. When Thames Valley Police received this information via the tape in 1994, one of their first actions was to cross-reference the details provided by Thomas with missing persons files from the Buckinghamshire region and surrounding areas during the 1960s. What they discovered was simultaneously validating and utterly devastating. In the August 1963 records, they found the case of 19-year-old Elizabeth Margaret Thornton, who was reported missing by her parents on August 15th of that year after failing to return home from a local party. The investigation at the time was extensive, but eventually stalled without any concrete leads, eventually fading over the years as so many missing persons cases unfortunately do when there is insufficient evidence to proceed. Elizabeth's physical description in the records matched exactly the description provided by Thomas in the recording, including specific details such as a small scar on her left knee from a childhood bicycle accident, a detail so particular that it would be impossible for someone to have invented it by chance. This correspondence confirmed to investigators that they were dealing with a genuine confession to an unsolved murder from 30 decades ago. Equipped with the approximate coordinates provided in the recording, a specialized forensic team was discreetly sent to the rural area described by Thomas in May 1994, 2 months after the initial discovery of the tape. What they found in that remote wooded area after 3 days of methodical searching using ground-penetrating radar equipment and dogs trained to detect ancient human remains confirmed the worst fears of everyone involved in the investigation. Buried approximately 5 feet deep, exactly where Thomas had indicated in relation to the natural landmarks he described, were the skeletal remains of a human body that later forensic analysis would confirm through preserved dental records of the time belonged to Elizabeth Margaret Thornton. The discovery finally brought answers to a family that had spent 31 years not knowing the fate of their daughter, but these answers came laden with the horrific truth about how she spent her last moments of life. Elizabeth's parents, already elderly in 1994, were informed of the discovery and finally were able to bury their daughter properly, although the pain of knowing exactly how she died was almost as devastating as the 30 years of uncertainty that preceded it. With confirmation that Thomas had indeed murdered Elizabeth Thornton in 1963, the police investigation entered a new phase, focused on identifying who this man was who confessed to the crime on cassette tape and determining whether he was still alive 30 years later or whether, as he stated in the recording, he had died of terminal cancer in the months following the recorded confession in 1964. The investigative team began by cross-referencing death records in the Buckinghamshire region and surrounding areas from men named Thomas who died between 1964 and 1965 from cancer or related illnesses, a tedious process involving manually examining hundreds of death certificates in municipal archives that had not yet been digitized.
Simultaneously, other investigators worked with forensic voice analysis specialists to create a detailed vocal profile that could eventually be compared with archived voice recordings should they be able to narrow the list of suspects sufficiently. The central problem was that Thomas was, and remains, an extremely common name in England. Without a surname or other more specific identifying information, finding the correct man in records from 60 years ago proved a monumentally challenging task. The big breakthrough in identification came not from death records or forensic analysis, but from something Thomas casually said later in the recording that seemed initially irrelevant, but turned out to be the key to unlocking his identity. At approximately 23 minutes into the tape, while reminiscing about his life before meeting Elizabeth, Thomas briefly mentions that he worked for 8 years as an administrative assistant in the local town hall's public works department, a job he described as tedious but stable, the kind of job people like me get and keep until retirement without ever really being noticed by anyone. This seemingly trivial information allowed investigators to drastically narrow the search field, cross-referencing municipal employment records from the 1950s and early 1960s with the list of men named Thomas who died during the relevant period. After weeks of meticulous work through dusty files stored in the basements of government buildings, investigators finally found a promising match: Thomas Edward Whittemore, born in 1922, employed in the Public Works Department from 1954 to 1962, died in January 1965 at the age of 42 from pancreatic cancer. The records on Thomas Whittemore painted a portrait of a man who lived almost his entire adult life in complete anonymity and willful mediocrity, exactly the kind of person who could commit a horrific crime and then simply return to his normal life without raising any suspicion. Born into a working-class family in Birmingham, he had an apparently uneventful childhood, attended school until the age of 16 with average grades, and was deemed unfit for military service during World War II due to severe flat feet and pronounced astigmatism, conditions that left him at home while most men of his generation were sent to combat. After the war, he moved to Buckinghamshire in 1948, seeking a fresh start away from his family.
But the most shocking discovery, and one that dramatically expanded the scope of the investigation, was another cassette tape found hidden in a rusty biscuit tin inside the dusty attic of the house. A second recording that no one knew existed until that moment. This second tape, apparently recorded a few weeks before the first, was approximately 38 minutes long and contained something that chilled the blood of all the investigators who listened to it. It was again the voice of Thomas Whittemore, this time not confessing about Elizabeth Thornton, but describing in disturbingly similar detail another crime, another encounter with a young woman, another moment of rejection followed by fatal violence. The woman in this second confession, whom Whittemore identified only as the red-haired girl from the library, had apparently rejected his unrequited romantic advances in 1959, 4 years before Elizabeth Thornton, and, according to the recorded confession, had suffered the same horrific fate under shockingly similar circumstances. This revelation transformed what investigators thought was a single murder case committed by a dying man consumed by guilt into something far more sinister, the possibility that Thomas Whittemore was a serial killer who had operated undetected for years, and that there might be more victims beyond the 2 he confessed to in the recordings. The discovery of the second cassette tape forced the investigation team to completely reassess everything they thought they knew about Thomas Whittemore and the nature of his crimes, transforming what initially appeared to be an isolated case of violence against a woman into a potentially much more extensive serial pattern. Investigators immediately began working to identify the victim mentioned in the second recording, the woman Whittemore described as the red-haired girl from the library, using the same methods they had successfully employed to identify Elizabeth Thornton. A search of the 1959 missing persons files revealed a case that disturbingly matched the details provided by Whittemore. Sarah Catherine Reynolds, 21 years old, a library assistant at the Buckinghamshire Public Library, reported missing by her fiancé in September 1959 after failing to show up for work for 3 consecutive days without any notice or explanation.
Sarah was described in the records as having distinctive natural red hair, being exactly 1 meter and 63 centimeters tall, with a characteristic mole on her left cheek that Whitmore had specifically mentioned in his recorded confession, a detail so particular that it would be virtually impossible to know without having had close contact with her. In the second recording, Whitmore describes how he developed an obsession with Sarah after he began frequenting the library regularly under the pretense of borrowing books on gardening and local history, topics in which he admits to having no genuine interest whatsoever, but which served as an excuse to interact with her several times a week. He recounts in minute detail how he memorized her work schedule, how he always chose times when he knew she would be at the service desk, how he prolonged his visits by pretending to need help locating specific books just to get a few more minutes of her attention. Sarah, as he describes with a disturbing lack of self-awareness, was always professional and cordial, but kept interactions strictly within the appropriate boundaries for an employee dealing with a library customer, something Whitmore misinterpreted as veiled romantic interest rather than simply good professional manners. He mentions how he began to convince himself that her polite smiles were signs of special affection, how he interpreted her willingness to help him find books as proof that she enjoyed his company, building in his mind a narrative of incipient romance that existed only in his distorted imagination and had no basis in reality. The breaking point with Sarah, as Whitmore confesses in the recording, came when he finally decided to take what he considered a natural next step in the imaginary relationship he had built in his head, waiting for her outside the library on a Friday afternoon and inviting her to dinner with him on the weekend. Sarah's response was polite but firm and unequivocal. She thanked him for the invitation, but explained that she was engaged, that it wouldn't be appropriate to have dinner alone with another man, and that she hoped he would understand and respect her boundaries. To any rational person, this would be a clear but respectful rejection that would definitively end the matter. For Whitmore, however, it was what he describes as a devastating betrayal, as if Sarah had deliberately deceived him by being polite to him for months when she was apparently committed to someone else the whole time. The anger in his voice when describing this moment in the recording is palpable even decades later, a narcissistic fury of someone who genuinely believed he was entitled to a woman's affection and romantic attention simply because he desired her, and who interpreted a polite rejection as an unforgivable personal offense that demanded retribution. What Whitmore describes doing in the days following that rejection demonstrates a level of premeditation and cold planning that is characteristic of experienced serial predators, not someone acting on emotional impulse in the heat of the moment. He recounts how he spent an entire week secretly observing Sarah, learning her complete routine outside of work, discovering where she lived, which streets she walked to and from the library, which cafes she frequented during her lunch break. He describes how he bought leather work gloves a size larger than his own from a store in another city to avoid leaving recognizable fingerprints, how he acquired nylon rope from a different hardware store, how he parked his car in strategic locations that would allow for a quick escape but would not be associated with the crime scenes later. This level of methodical preparation suggests that even if it was possibly his first crime of such magnitude, Whitmore already possessed an intuitive or perhaps studied understanding of how to avoid detection, how to cover his tracks, how to operate in the shadows without leaving evidence that could connect him to the inevitable disappearance of his victim. The confession about what happened to Sarah Reynolds on a September night in 1959 is as detailed and disturbing as the confession about Elizabeth Thornton, following an almost identical operational pattern that confirmed to investigators they were definitely dealing with a serial predator with an established modus operandi. Whitmore describes how he waited for her in a particularly dimly lit stretch of her usual route home, hidden behind a dense hedge that offered perfect cover, how he quickly approached as she passed, wearing rubber-soled sneakers to minimize the sound of her footsteps. The subsequent details are viscerally horrific and need not be reproduced in full here, but suffice it to say that Sarah suffered immensely before she died, and that Whitmore recounts everything with that same cold emotional detachment that characterizes both recordings, as if he were describing a technical procedure rather than the brutal murder of an innocent human being. He specifically mentions how, "This time I learned from some mistakes," a chilling statement that suggests there may have been previous attempts or non-fatal incidents preceding Sarah's murder, crimes that were never reported or investigated. Following the pattern set with Elizabeth Thornton years later, Whitmore confesses to burying Sarah's body in a remote location, this time in a partially drained swamp area approximately 20 kilometers from Buckinghamshire, chosen specifically because the waterlogged, acidic soil would accelerate decomposition and make eventual discovery even less likely. He provides approximate coordinates again, with the same narcissistic arrogance demonstrated in the first recording, wanting to ensure that his work would eventually be correctly attributed to him even if discovered after his death. When the forensic team was sent to the indicated area in July 1994, 3 months after the recordings were discovered, they faced significantly greater challenges than they had faced in locating Elizabeth's remains due to the environmental changes the terrain had undergone in 39 years and the nature of the swampy soil that complicated search efforts. After 2 weeks of meticulous and frustrating work, using specialized detection equipment and bringing in forensic archaeology experts who had experience recovering human remains from aquatic environments, they finally located partial skeletal remains that later analysis would confirm, through dental records and DNA comparison with living relatives of Sarah, belonged to Sarah Catherine Reynolds. With confirmation that Thomas Whitmore had murdered at least 2 young women over a 4-year period between 1959 and 1963, the investigation entered its most complex and psychologically challenging phase, determining whether there were more victims beyond the 2 he confessed to in the found recordings. Investigators faced a fundamental question that haunts every investigation of serial killers discovered decades after their crimes. Were these truly all the victims, or merely those he chose to confess to? Seriological statistics suggest that serial predators rarely stop voluntarily after developing a successful operational pattern, and the fact that Whitmore operated undetected for at least 4 years between Sarah and Elizabeth raised the disturbing possibility that there might be additional victims during that intervening period or even before Sarah. The investigation team dramatically expanded its scope, initiating a systematic review of all cases of young women who disappeared in central England between 1955 and 1964, a Herculean task that would involve examining hundreds of old files and attempting to establish connections to a man who had died 30 years earlier. To assist in this massive cold case review process, investigators consulted criminal profiling experts from the FBI and the behavioral science unit at Quantico, discreetly sharing case details under strict confidentiality agreements due to the sensitive nature of the ongoing investigation. The FBI profilers, after reviewing transcripts of recordings and all the biographical material collected on Whitmore, created a detailed psychological profile that offered disturbing insights into how his mind worked and what types of victims he was likely to have chosen. According to their analysis, Whitmore demonstrated classic characteristics of an organized serial killer with a strong narcissistic component and pronounced psychopathic traits, someone who selected victims based on specific criteria that satisfied his particular fantasies of control and domination. The profile suggested that his victims were likely young women between the ages of 18 and 25, physically attractive by conventional standards, who held positions where public interaction was part of their daily life, and crucially,
the most promising of these 4 cases involved a young woman named Margaret Rose Ashford, 22 years old, who disappeared in April 1961, precisely midway between the confirmed murders of Sarah Reynolds and Elizabeth Thornton. Margaret worked as a receptionist at a dental clinic located just 3 blocks from the town hall building where Whitmore was employed in the Public Works Department at the time, a geographical proximity that would certainly place them within the same broad social circle of the small community. Investigators discovered through preserved employment records that the Public Works Department had carried out minor repairs to the dental clinic's heating system in February 1961, 2 months before Margaret's disappearance. And although there was no specific record of which employees were sent to perform this work, Whitmore, as an administrative assistant, would have had legitimate reason to visit the site as part of his duties of supervising and documenting completed services. Even more disturbing, a co-worker of Margaret's who was located and interviewed in 1994, now 71 years old but with a remarkably clear memory of the events, recalled a strange and awkward man from the works department who appeared several times at the clinic in the weeks after the repairs were completed, always with some excuse about checking if the work had been satisfactory, and who seems to pay particular attention to Margaret in a way that made both women uncomfortable. Despite these intriguing circumstantial connections, investigators faced a fundamental problem. There was no recorded confession from Margaret Ashford or for the other three possible additional victims they had identified. Without a confession from Whitmore and without bodies that could be located and forensically examined to establish cause of death and possible physical connections to the perpetrator, all they had were suspicions based on patterns and geographical and temporal coincidences. The agonizing question that haunted the investigative team was, why did Whitmore choose to confess only about Sarah and Elizabeth in his recordings? He had made these recordings with the explicit purpose of confessing to his darkest crimes before he died, so why omit other victims if there really were more? Forensic psychologists consulted by the investigation offered several possible theories. One theory suggested that Sarah and Elizabeth may have been the only victims Whitmore actually killed, the other cases being genuine coincidences of unrelated disappearances that only seemed to fit the profile due to the relatively common nature of such crimes at the time. Another theory proposed that Whitmore may have confessed only to the victims whose murders he considered most personally significant or of which he had the most vivid memories, potentially omitting other crimes that were less memorable or important to him in his distorted personal narrative. A third theory, perhaps the most disturbing of all, suggested that the two tapes found were not necessarily the only recordings Whitmore had made, and that there might be additional confessions still hidden somewhere, waiting to be discovered, perhaps in other properties where he had lived throughout his life, in possessions that were discarded after his death without being properly examined, or in locations he frequented where he might have hidden other artifacts of his crimes. This possibility led the investigation to expand further, with teams revisiting all known residences where Whitmore had lived during his adult life, attempting to gain access to properties that had changed hands multiple times in the following decades, speaking with current owners, and requesting permission to conduct complete structural searches. In two cases, current owners allowed forensic teams to thoroughly examine their properties, removing wall panels, inspecting attics and basements, even using ground-penetrating radar equipment to check for hidden cavities in the structures. These searches did not reveal any additional recordings, but at a property where Whitmore had rented a room between 1957 and 1959, investigators found hidden behind a built-in wardrobe a small personal diary that Whitmore had apparently forgotten or abandoned when he moved, a worn, leather-bound notebook containing entries dated over 18 months that would offer an even more disturbing window into his deteriorating psychology and his increasingly violent impulses during the period immediately preceding the confirmed murder of Sarah Reynolds. The diary discovered at Whitmore's former residence contained approximately 140 pages of handwritten entries dated between January 1957 and June 1958, written in a tight, angular handwriting that became progressively more erratic and difficult to decipher as the entries progressed chronologically, as if the author's mental state were visually deteriorating on the page itself. The earliest entries were relatively mundane, describing frustrations with work, complaints about noisy neighbors, observations about the weather, and other trivial aspects of daily life that could have been written by any lonely person processing the ordinary tedium of existence. However, beginning in March 1957, the entries began to include increasingly frequent references to specific women Whitmore observed in his daily routine, detailed descriptions of their physical appearances, speculations about their personal lives and relationships, and progressively elaborate fantasies about imaginary romantic scenarios involving these women completely unaware of his obsessive attention.
The tone of these entries oscillated disturbingly between almost poetic, idealized adoration and bitter resentment when the women in question did not behave in ways that matched his expectations he had constructed for them in his imagination, revealing a profound emotional instability and a fundamental inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality in his interactions with the opposite sex. Particularly revealing was a series of entries from August to October 1957 focused intensely on a woman whom Whitmore identified only as L and who apparently worked at a bakery he frequented regularly during his mornings before going to work. The entries document a classic escalation of stalking behavior. Initially, he would just visit the bakery frequently and jot down small details about L in his diary. Then he began adjusting his daily route to casually encounter her in locations other than the bakery, then progressed to finding out where she lived and passing by her house at strategic times hoping to see her, and finally reached the point of waiting outside her residence for hours on end just to observe her through the windows when the curtains were not completely closed. What makes these entries especially disturbing is not just the stalking behavior itself, but Whitmore's complete lack of recognition that his behavior was appropriate, invasive, or alarming. In his diary entry, he presents these actions as evidence of his deep love and romantic devotion, as if stalking and spying on a woman who was unaware of his existence was perfectly normal and even admirable behavior for someone genuinely in love. The climax of the documented obsession with L came in an entry dated October 26, 1957, where Whitmore describes finally gathering the courage to approach L directly when he saw her leaving the bakery at the end of her work shift. He recounts the conversation in minute detail, and even through his own obviously distorted and self-centered narrative, it is clear that L was deeply uncomfortable and alarmed by the approach. According to his own description, he approached her on the street, introduced himself using her full name, and then proceeded to demonstrate extensive knowledge about her life and routine that he had no legitimate way to know without having stalked her, including comments about where she lived, what days she worked specific shifts, and even mentioning that he had noticed she had recently changed the color of her living room curtains. Elle's reaction, predictably, was of shock and evident fear. She physically recoiled from him, told him not to approach her again, and threatened to call the police if he continued to stalk her. Whitmore's emotional response to this rejection, documented in his entry that night, was an explosive mixture of humiliation, anger, and a desire for revenge that investigators would recognize 30 decades later as a direct precursor to the type of violence he would eventually perpetrate against Sarah Reynolds and Elizabeth Thornton.
What differentiates the situation with Elle from the later confirmed murders, and what likely saved her life, was a subsequent entry dated 2 days later, where Whitmore documents that Elle apparently took her threats seriously and reported the stalking incident to the local police. An officer visited Whitmore at his residence, issued a formal warning about harassment behavior, and made it clear that any further contact with Elle would result in serious legal consequences, including possible arrest. This police intervention, while relatively mild by modern standards, was apparently enough to scare Whitmore enough to make him cease his active stalking of Elle specifically, although subsequent diary entries reveal that he remained emotionally obsessed with her for months afterward, writing bitter entries about how she ruined everything and didn't understand his true feelings by involving the authorities. In 1994, investigators attempted to identify and locate the woman referred to as Elle using the details provided in the diary, partly to warn her about her historical proximity to a confirmed serial killer, and partly hoping she could provide additional information about Whitmore's behavior and mental state during that period. Unfortunately, with only an initial and vague physical descriptions, and considering that 37 years had passed, they were unable to conclusively identify her, although they did find a filed police report from October 1957 about a stalking incident involving a man whose name had been redacted from the documents according to privacy protocols of the time. Further on in the diary, entries from 1958 show Whitmore developing an increasingly distorted and dangerous personal philosophy about relationships between men and women, writing long pseudo-intellectual paragraphs attempting to justify his impulses to control and dominate women as something natural and even noble, as opposed to the rejection and humiliation he repeatedly experienced in reality.
He makes references to readings of pseudoscientific texts on evolutionary psychology and power dynamics between genders that were popular in certain fringe circles at the time, distorting and misinterpreting these ideas to construct a narrative where he was simultaneously and unjustly victimized by women who did not recognize his worth and a man who was superiorly understanding of the true natures that women supposedly hid under social veneers of independence and choice. Forensic psychologists who analyzed the diary in 1994 identified these entries as classic examples of pathological rationalization, where an individual with profound empathy and control issues builds elaborate ideological castles to justify impulses that, at a more fundamental and honest level, simply stem from narcissistic rage at not getting what he wants. A particularly revealing entry from April 1958 contains the phrase, "One day, one of them will understand completely, even if I have to make her understand the hard way." A statement that, in retrospect, reads as a direct foreshadowing of the fatal violence he would perpetrate against Sarah Reynolds 18 months later. The diary ends abruptly in June 1958 without explanation, the last entry being a mundane observation about the warm weather that summer, and then nothing more. Investigators theorize that Whitmore simply forgot about the diary when he moved from that residence in September 1958 to a different property closer to the city center, leaving it hidden behind the closet where it would be discovered decades later. The period between the end of the diary in June 1958 and the murder of Sarah Reynolds in September 1959 remains largely opaque to investigators. 15 months about which they have very little concrete information about what Whitmore was doing, thinking, or planning. No further diaries were discovered covering this period. The cassette tape recordings do not address these intervening months in any significant detail, and witnesses from the time offered only vague and fragmented memories of a man who was apparently living a superficially normal outward life, while inwardly, as we now know, he was progressing toward becoming a murderer. What investigators know for certain, based on the recorded confession and forensic evidence, is that at some point during those obscure 15 months, Thomas Whitmore crossed the definitive line from violent thoughts and fantasies to actual violent action, transforming himself from a disturbed but non-lethal stalker into a predator who would take at least 2 confirmed lives and possibly more that we will never know for sure. The investigation into Thomas Whitmore and his crimes was officially closed in December 1996, 2 years and 9 months after the initial discovery of the first cassette tape under the floorboards of that Victorian house in Buckinghamshire. But the disturbing questions the case raised remained unanswered and continue to haunt all those involved to this day. Despite the Herculean efforts of dozens of dedicated investigators, the extensive forensic analysis of 2 crime scenes discovered decades after the events, the in-depth psychological examination of diaries and recordings left by the perpetrator, and interviews with hundreds of people who knew or met Whitmore during his life, the full truth about how many victims he actually had remains shrouded in frustrating and incomplete mystery. The final investigation report concluded with absolute forensic certainty that Thomas Whitmore murdered Sarah Catherine Reynolds in 1959 and Elizabeth Margaret Thornton in 1963, and classified as highly suspicious but not conclusively proven 4 additional cases of young women who disappeared during the same period, under similar circumstances and with circumstantial connections to Whitmore. The families of Sarah and Elizabeth finally received answers and were able to properly bury their daughters after decades of agonizing uncertainty. But the families of these other 4 women continued to live in the cruel limbo of never knowing for sure what happened to their loved ones, a special kind of torment that is perhaps even worse than the terrible certainty of confirmed death. The most frustrating and unsettling aspect of the entire case for investigators was not only the impossibility of determining the exact number of Whitmore's victims, but the profound question of how many other Thomas Whitmores exist or have existed operating in the shadows of society without ever being detected or punished for their crimes. Whitmore managed to murder at least 2 women and possibly as many as 6 over approximately 8 years during the 1950s and early 1960s, an era where forensic methods were primitive compared to modern standards, where missing persons cases often received inadequate investigative attention, especially if the victims were young adult women who might have simply run away according to the prejudices of the time, and where public awareness of serial killers as a distinct category of criminal was virtually non-existent. He was a completely average man in almost every observable aspect of his life, working a tedious bureaucratic job, living alone in modest residences, and drawing no particular attention to himself except for occasional episodes of strange behavior with women that were minimized or ignored by society at the time. If it hadn't been for his decision to record confessions on cassette tape before he died, driven by some complex combination of belated guilt, a narcissistic desire for recognition, and perhaps even a distorted kind of regret, his crimes probably would never have been discovered. Sarah and Elizabeth would remain unresolved missing persons forever, and he would go to his grave taking his secrets with him without anyone ever knowing the dark truth about the quiet man at number 47 that nobody really knew. The question that haunts cold-blood crime investigators and serial killer researchers to this day is how many other unsolved cases from decades ago are actually the work of predators who died undetected, without convenient recorded confessions to guide posthumous investigators to their victims. The statistics are simultaneously imprecise and terrifying when one actually stops to consider them seriously. In the UK alone, there are approximately 1,500 long-term missing persons cases classified as unsolved from the 1950s to 1970s, cases where individuals simply vanished without a trace and were never found alive or dead. How many of these 1,500 cases represent victims of serial predators like Thomas Whitmore, who were simply never caught or identified? How many Thomas Whitmores lived their entire lives, committed multiple murders, died of natural causes in their beds, surrounded by people who had no idea what that kind old man had done in his youth, and took their horrific secrets to anonymous graves without anyone ever knowing the dark truth about the quiet man at number 47 that nobody really knew? The uncomfortable truth that the Whitmore case forces any thinking person to confront is that the homicide clearance rate, especially for historical homicides from decades ago, is much lower than most people realize or feel comfortable admitting, and that the number of murderers who literally got away with their crimes, simply surviving their periods of criminal activity until they died of old age, is probably much, much higher than any comforting narrative would like to admit. There is also the disturbing question of how many potential predators are operating at this very moment in 2026, who decades in the future will be discovered posthumously in the same way Whitmore was, or perhaps never discovered at all. Modern forensic methods are undeniably more advanced than they were in the 1960s, with forensic DNA, computerized fingerprint analysis, ubiquitous camera surveillance, digital records of nearly every aspect of modern life, and interconnected databases that facilitate pattern recognition across multiple jurisdictions. However, these same technological advancements are also available for criminals intelligent, careful, and patient enough to study and circumvent, and the statistical reality remains that many violent crimes still go unsolved even with all these modern tools at their disposal. A predator who commits just 1 or 2 murders spaced years apart, who leaves no usable forensic evidence at the crime scenes, who chooses victims in a seemingly random manner with no obvious connections between them, who does not follow predictable geographical or temporal patterns, and then simply stops killing and returns to an apparently normal life, represents an extraordinarily difficult investigative challenge even with all the modern technology. Thomas Whitmore, if he were operating today instead of the 1960s, would likely be caught due to forensic DNA and camera surveillance. But a more careful and technological aware version of him, someone who has studied modern forensic methods and takes appropriate precautions, could theoretically still operate on the fringes and in the shadows of